Happy Easter, church. I'm so glad you're here on this special Sunday. If it's your first time at South Hills, I'd like to personally say welcome and thank you for joining us. My name is Moses Camacho. I'm the senior pastor of South Hills Church. You've walked into one of many of our locations, and by the time you leave today, you probably will have had some coffee, maybe some candy, heard about how you can get connected, experienced worship, met some new people, listened to a message from one of our campus pastors. But my biggest hope is that you would leave feeling seen and accepted. We are not a perfect church full of perfect people, but we do make every effort to be the perfect place for imperfect people. And if you stick around, I think you'll find that there's a place for you to belong here. I also want to invite you to join us the next week as we kick off a 3-week series, which means for the last 3 weeks of April, we are going to unpack how a movement based on Christ's unconditional love became something that so many now want nothing to do with. It's a statistical fact that fewer and fewer Americans are self-identifying as Christians. Some have never even stepped into a church. Others grew up in one and couldn't wait to get out, and many have experienced things they can't imagine God being okay with. What would it look like to find our way back to something closer to the heartbeat of God? So I hope you enjoy our Easter Sunday, and I also really hope you come back to be a part of this 3-week teaching series.
The celebration of Easter is a celebration of one of the most important moments in history, and certainly the most important moment in Christianity. Easter is the celebration of the resurrection of Jesus, marking the defeat of sin and death once and for all. And maybe one of the more fascinating things that maybe we don't think about a whole lot when it comes to Easter is how unexpected it was, right? No one was sitting at the tomb counting down from 10. No one was sitting outside that tomb like, all right, 10, 9, 8, expecting to be able to see Jesus be resurrected, right? The disciples had scattered. The followers of Jesus had kind of given up. And Mary, Jesus' mother, wasn't even waiting for him. And they all expected Jesus to stay dead, not because they didn't believe that he'd rise from the grave, but because they all thought that his salvation would look different. They thought that it would look different. They believed in a Messiah and a Savior that would come and overthrow the oppressive regimes, defeat enemies, and conquer the world with power. And for us today, whether we're in the room or online, maybe we're not any clearer than they were on the first Easter, right? When we think of Easter, we usually think of it through the lens of dressing up in matching outfits, baskets filled with candy or Peeps, flowers, and lots and lots and lots and lots of bunnies. That's what we think about, right? And I love all of that stuff. Believe me, like the matching outfits, the candy, I love all that stuff. Flowers are cool, bunnies don't hurt me. I love all that stuff except for Peeps. And if you are, thank you. If you're a Peep person, I'll pray for you. They just taste gross, I'm just being honest. But the actual resurrection story is one of flesh, dirt, confusion, and the way that God never seems to adhere to our expectations. Look at what John chapter 20, verses 11 through 18, it says this. Now Mary stood outside the tomb crying. As she wept, she bent over to look into the tomb and saw 2 angels in white seated where Jesus' body had been, one at the head and the other at the foot. They asked her, "Woman, why are you crying?" "They have taken my Lord away," she said, "and I don't know where they have put him." At this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing there, but she did not realize that it was Jesus. He asked her, "Woman, why are you crying?" First of all, can we just talk about why the angels and Jesus talk like that? Like, she has a name, right? I think it's kind of funny. "Woman, why are you crying? Who is it you are looking for?" Thinking he was the gardener, Mary said, "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you put him, and I will get him." Jesus said to her, "Mary." She turned toward him and cried out in Aramaic, "Rabboni," which means teacher. Jesus said, "Do not hold on to me, for I have not yet ascended to the Father. Go instead to my brothers and tell them I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." Mary Magdalene went to the disciples with the news, "I have seen the Lord." And she told them that he had said these things to her. All right? This isn't a message about this, but I just want to make it clear that the very first person to ever bring the good news to the world was a woman. And for some of us who've grown up in church, who have certain preconceptions about church, that's undeniable. The first person to bring the good news to the world was a woman. It was Mary, right? And that's not what this message is about. I just think it's important to point out. But what we want you to get from this passage is this. Something that we often overlook when it comes to the story of the resurrection. Mary, who had spent the last few years with Jesus, who loved Jesus, who left everything to follow Jesus, and was even there when he was crucified, did not recognize Jesus. She didn't recognize Jesus. The paintings and movies and TV representations of Jesus are usually like a wingless angel glowing and bright white, but I've never seen any depictions of gardener Jesus. Right? Never seen an image of Jesus as the gardener. But Mary wasn't expecting a resurrection, and she definitely did not recognize Jesus. Mary was looking for Jesus, but maybe she missed him because she wasn't open to seeing him, how he might show up. She couldn't imagine Jesus looking any differently than the picture in her mind. And this isn't just a Mary issue. We see this in the book of Luke. We see two disciples, one whose name is given to us. His name is Cleopas, walking back home from Jerusalem. And after attending the Passover festival, they're discussing the death and passion of Jesus. And it tells us that Jesus comes up alongside of them. And it says that they don't recognize Jesus, right? And so they're still talking, and you could tell that there's some disappointment there because they're no longer referring to Jesus as the Son of God or the Messiah. They simply refer to Jesus as a prophet because the God or the Messiah they had hoped for, the Son of God, wouldn't have died, right? That's what they thought. Instead, they just called him a prophet. And it goes on to tell us that they started to talk about Jesus to Jesus without recognizing him. And it wasn't until Jesus took some bread, broke it, gave thanks, and gave it to them that their eyes were open. That's what it says. And then they recognized, oh my gosh, it's Jesus. This guy that we have been talking about, right? And then we see in John chapter 21, we see the disciples going fishing, and they were terrible fishers. They couldn't catch anything. And then one morning, Jesus is on the shore. And Jesus miraculously, and they don't recognize that it's Jesus on the shore. And Jesus miraculously fills their nets with fish. And after the miracle, after Jesus filling their nets with fish, then they recognize and realize that it's Jesus. But it wasn't until the miracle happened that they started to realize who it was. Now, it sounds borderline ridiculous to think that we could somehow not recognize Jesus. I mean, we're all here. Whether you're in the room or online, we're all here at church on Easter, right? We should be able to recognize Jesus. But if you're taking notes, you can write this down. If Jesus' closest friends and followers didn't recognize him physically in their presence, why would we assume we'd automatically notice his presence in our lives today? Think about it. If the people who actually lived with him, walked with him, could not even recognize him, what makes us think that we can just assume that we would automatically be able to recognize his presence and in our lives today? Why would we do any better? I think we all have an idea of where we need help in our lives, where we need healing in our lives. And I think we all have an idea of what salvation, being saved by God, looks like or should look like. But what if we're wrong? What if we're waiting for the wrong things or putting our eggs, see what I did there, in the wrong basket? It's Easter. It's eggs. And what if you're putting them in the wrong basket? I think there are three ways that Mary and the disciples missed Jesus that first Easter, and I think we're in danger of the same. And the first way, and if you're taking notes, you can write this down, Mary mistook him for a gardener. Mary mistook him for a gardener. What do gardeners do? Gardeners do everything slowly and meticulously. Their hands are in the dirt, working, weeding, and supporting. And gardening is slow, consistent work over a long period of time. You don't plant a seed and then the next day you see the thing that you planted. It doesn't work like that, right? If it did, I'd probably be gardening. But I don't have patience for it, right? It takes time, and we live in a microwave culture. Think about this. How many of us get frustrated when our movie or TV show doesn't load quickly enough on our phone while we're flying in a plane across the country? How many of us have gotten frustrated because of that, right? You're at the airport and you're trying to download the movie that you want to watch on Netflix or Amazon Prime, whatever it may be, because you can download things now, and then the Wi-Fi in the airport's not downloading it fast enough, right? And then you still watch it. You still start it, right? And then it just stops where the download stops. How many of us have done that? I'm guilty of it all the time, right? And then we get frustrated, right? It's because we live in a culture that has taught us to want things and demand things right now. But I wonder how many of us are missing Jesus because we're moving too fast or we think he's moving too slow. I wonder how many of us are missing Jesus at work in our lives because we're moving too fast or we think he's moving too slow. The second way that the disciples missed Jesus that first Easter is the disciples on the road thought he was just a stranger. They didn't recognize him. He's walking right next to them. And they couldn't recognize him. They thought it was just this random dude walking next to him. Right? And we're surrounded, you and I, we're surrounded by people all the time. But most of us, what we do is we just try to avoid making eye contact with people that we don't know. I would say that some of us avoid eye contact with people we do know. Right? How many of us have done that? Right? You're out and about and you see someone you know and you're like, oh, like I don't have time for that today. Let me just hit that U-turn. Right? I'm not gonna lie, I've done it. Right? I've been out and I see someone and I'm like, oh, I ain't got time for that today. And I'm just gonna turn around. And like there have been times where I've needed to go to the store to get something and I've walked out of the store to avoid people. Right? And I was like, okay, I don't care what I need. Like I just need to leave, right? Here's what we have to understand, right? There's a reason that God puts people around us. Jesus was very clear that when we love, serve, feed, and care for people around us, it's as though we're doing it for him. Jesus speaks to us through people. He guides us through people. He cares for us through people. He works in our lives, guess what? Through people. And I wonder what we're missing when we don't pay attention to the people that Jesus has placed around us. What are we missing when we don't pay attention to the people that God has placed around us? The third way the disciples missed Jesus is the disciples in the boat didn't pay attention until the miracle. They didn't pay attention until they saw Jesus perform the miracle of filling their nets with fish. And most of us, maybe many of us in this room or watching online, are probably hoping that today God will show up in a big, miraculous way in our lives. And can I tell you, unfortunately, for many of us, if we don't see the miracle, then we don't see God. That we assume his presence isn't here if his power isn't seen. And the greatest miracle that Jesus performs for all of us and for all of humanity through his death on the cross and his resurrection is saving us from our sin. And can I tell you, bad news, none of us will ever see that. But it's the greatest miracle that Jesus ever performed for us, is saving us from our sin, saving us from our shame. And none of us will ever see that. And unfortunately, for many of us, it's the reason we don't believe. But then what is the purpose and the point of faith? Right? And so I wonder how many of us are missing out on all that God has for us, all that Jesus wants to do in our life because it doesn't look as big and as miraculous as we thought it would. When Jesus spoke to a weeping and confused Mary, he asked her two questions. He said, "Why are you crying and who are you looking for?" And I believe for many of us that Jesus is asking us the same question. Why are you crying and who are you looking for? What if salvation looks different than what you expected? What if God's been showing up in your life in beautiful and ordinary ways and you've just been missing it because you were told or you thought that it had to look a certain way or that it had to look different? And if you're taking notes, here's our big idea today. When your idea of salvation is predefined, you risk missing it entirely. When your idea of salvation is predefined, you risk missing it entirely. When being saved by a God who would give everything so that you could be with him has to look a certain way, match your expectations, you risk missing the entire thing. And you can write this down. Many of us have missed Jesus because we're looking for a perfect, shiny, and glowing angel, when in reality, he might be dressed in the ordinary and dirty clothes of a Savior who is with us, not above us. Many of us, we want the Jesus with the beautiful hair, pristine beard, like spotless linen gown, right? Birkenstocks on his feet, right? That's the Jesus that we expect, right? And when we don't get that Jesus, because maybe he's dressed in dirty clothes that you would never sit next to, looking like an ordinary person, not shiny at all, not glamorous at all. And because you're looking for the wrong thing, you end up missing the right thing. When we have this picture of a clean and tidy God, it's easy to assume that he wants clean and tidy followers. But can I tell you, if that's what God wanted, I wouldn't be here today. If that's what this was about, oh God, you got the wrong guy. And culture isn't helping us, right? Because we see on social media, we see the people post the Instagram versus reality thing. How many of us have seen those things, right? I saw a friend of mine, she posted this thing, and I thought it was hilarious. She posted this picture. That's, I guess, what she saw, and she wanted to do it, and that looks cool. I don't know what that is, like a chick or duck thing, pretzel thing, whatever. And then she posted what it actually looked like. Ooh, my God, my God. Wow. What is that? Right? Oh. Now here's the thing. We see this, and here's what we think, because we treat Jesus the same way. We see this. Like, in reality, we expect Jesus to look like the first picture. And when he comes into our lives, oftentimes it ends up looking and feeling like that picture. But we say, because it doesn't look like the first picture, that's not what it is. Somehow it's lost its value. Somehow that's not the same thing. There's no way that can be the same thing. Can I tell you that it probably tastes the same? It just looks different, right? If your parents in the room and you have young kids, you probably experience this too, right? We have this Instagram of our kid, right? And they look a certain way, right? Like, oh my gosh, right? That's what y'all say, okay? Everyone. I'm like, y'all don't live with this boy, right? Like he's so cute. Look at those big old teeth and those dimples, and he's just cheesing, right? And then the reality sets in, and it really looks like this. Like, having a kid really looks like that most of the time. And can I tell you that whether he looked like the first picture or that picture, that it doesn't change how much I love him. It doesn't change the reality that I would give everything for him. Whether he looked like the first picture or he was covered and filthy, full of chocolate cake. And that's what God wants you to know. Is that the experience of salvation, the experience of Jesus coming to be with us, probably looks a little bit messier than we're expecting. And if we're looking for the shiny thing, the clean thing, the perfect thing, we're looking for the wrong thing, and because of that, we end up missing the right thing. If you think salvation looks like perfection and piety, can I tell you something? You'll never find it, and you'll never experience it. Some of us have missed Jesus because we expected the cuddly baby from the Christmas story, sweet, innocent, and never asking anything hard from us. But Jesus calls us to follow him and his way. And can I tell you, that's hard. Some of us have just been looking for the moral teacher. We've been trying our best to live by the rules, but we've got this aching sense that we're still missing something, because the salvation Jesus offers isn't just about behavior modification. It's about heart transformation, that Jesus doesn't want to just change the way that you act. He wants to change the way that you think. He wants to change the way that you feel inside of your heart. And the natural overflow of that is wanting your life to look differently. But some of us, we're just stuck in like, I'm just going to do these things, and maybe then I'll experience Jesus. Some of us have been looking for a Jesus who crushes our enemies in this world, or at least the righteous judge who will strike down the broken or evil people around us. But you know, it's never me that needs to be judged, because I'm perfect. But God, can you strike down that person? Because they're not perfect, but I am. And Jesus is like, you know who I'm actually spending time with? That person. You want me to strike down? That's who I'm hanging out with. And you're missing me because you're judging them when you're just like them. Some of us are searching for a Jesus who, if we believe hard enough, gives us all the good things we want, like a grandparent giving us treats when our parents aren't around. We just need to do enough good things and then we'll get there. But when we're set on looking for these other versions of Jesus, we'll end up weeping and feeling lost, just like Mary was. Jesus asked Mary, why are you crying? Who are you looking for? And it's as if to say that Jesus was saying to Mary that if you're looking for the right thing, you wouldn't be crying. The message of Easter is that God so loved the world that Jesus gave his life as a sacrifice for us for the forgiveness of sins. The message of Easter is that the powerful and perfect love of God raised Christ from the dead, defeating both sin and death once and for all. The message of Easter is that you and I are invited to experience a new and flourishing life that only a gardener like Jesus could cultivate and grow in us. The message of Easter is not about becoming perfect, but being personal. And if you're taking notes, you can write this down. Jesus, the real Jesus, wants to be known by you, and he wants to know you. It's not about becoming perfect, it's about being personal. Because Jesus wants to personally be known by you, and he wants to know you personally. And so I want to invite the worship team to come back. And I'm going to have them sing a song over us. And as they do, I want to encourage us to just think about this. Think about this thing. Identify the rules you've held on to and exchange them for the freedom of God's salvation. Right? What are the things that you have maybe unknowingly, maybe knowingly, have been holding on to that have actually kept you from experiencing all that God has for you, all that Jesus wants for you? And as they sing this song over you, I want to encourage you to just go from being like this to being like this. And saying, God, whatever it looks like to follow you, whatever it looks like to experience your salvation for me, your healing for me, your power at work in me, your presence at work in me, that's what I want.